beer, it's good for you.
Hello and welcome to the video. Within this video I'm going to provide you with all of the information you need to brew what I believe is the best Guinness-like clone beer that I have ever tasted. It's no secret that Guinness have many versions of their recipes, and these vary quite wildly in taste and ABV level from country to country. Stout is without doubt my favourite beer style, and for quite some time now I've been experimenting with and tweaking various recipes that have led to the point now where I have one recipe that is ready for sharing that to my mind offers a very good Guinness-like experience and actually tastes exceptionally good, which is naturally also very important. So let's go on the journey and get started. Let's start off with a look at this recipe's vital statistics. As you can see, the recipe offers an approximate ABV of 5.6%, making it a very good session beer that can be enjoyed throughout an evening. The BU-GU ratio, shown almost at the bottom, shows the relationship between the bitterness and alcohol at 0.76, making this one a very easy drinking beer. You will also note that this one has a higher EBC than usual for a regular Irish stout, but Guinness is also very dark itself. Not that this was my main concern here, the darkness is simply a byproduct of what was needed for an effective clone. This recipe, as always, like all of my shared recipes, has gone through various stages of development and tweaking to reach its current state, which gets my full approval, so please do brew with confidence. My recipe can be found in full within the video's description area, which is underneath the video window when viewed on a desktop computer. You will also find a link there to the full recipe on Brewfather, which can be used free of charge with some restrictions. I strongly suggest that you fully convert the recipe before ordering in your ingredients so that you're actually brewing the recipe as intended. I also strongly suggest that you brew this recipe as is the first time, rather than tweaking it, as naturally tweaks are already in place to bring this recipe into a very good shape. I have an easy guide to recipe conversion using Brewfather on my channel, as shown on screen now. Within this video, this recipe is being brewed using a Brew Monk B40 Wi-Fi brewing system to the volume of 20 litres or 5.28 US liquid gallons. But as part of the conversion process, this can be scaled and shaped to suit your own brewing system and volume requirements. Shown on screen now is the water profile that I highly recommend for using with this recipe, which is a widely used Dublin profile that is superb for stouts and dark ales. Using the right water profile is very important. After all, beer is mostly water, and its balance is vital, so that it suits the beer that you are brewing. Naturally, this water profile is just one way to go here. If you have a different profile that you really enjoy with this kind of beer style, then go with that one. But do bear in mind that this recipe was written with this profile in mind, and has been tweaked according to the results obtained whilst using this profile. Do not worry if you're new to this, Brewfather has very good documentation on how to use the software to make the necessary water changes too. This makes the whole process very easy, so as such I suggest that all brewers, irrespective of experience, start treating their water as soon as possible for the very best of end results. You may well be surprised how easy this actually is. Okay, let's get into the brew itself. This starts by adding all the grain to preheated mash water and then giving them a good mix to ensure that there are no clumps and that every grain is wet. In some dark beer recipes I recommend adding the dark grains later on, but with this recipe this is not necessary. The mash schedule is now shown on screen, and unlike some clone recipes, this one uses a very middle of the road mash temperature to achieve its flavour profile. Once you have given all of your grains a good mixing, you're then ready to start the mash. Do not be surprised with this one if your mash is quite foamy at first. This is to be expected with a grain bill such as this one. This is very likely to clear up as you progress. Let's now look at the all-important grain bill for this one. At 68% of our grist we have Otter malt. Do not skip on this and use a regular power malt, and I would not recommend Golden Promise either, as it has the sweeter flavour that is unwanted by this clone recipe. We then have Flaked Barley at 20%. This will provide both head retention, foam stability and body, as well as a rich grainy flavour that is very important to this recipe. 20% is quite a lot, but I have seen some clone recipes use more. The problem here is that this can provide too potent a flavour, and due to the lack of diastatic power in flaked barley, a very poor mash efficiency. At 10% we have roasted barley, which is another typical stout ingredient. Roasted barley provides a very good level of roasted coffee flavouring, and at the same time darkens the colour to a nice deep black. Then finally at 2% we have chocolate malt, which I've specified in my recipe as a dehusked version. If at all possible, I strongly recommend using the Wyoming chocolate malt Carafa Special III. Not only is it dehusked, meaning it will not carry as much astringency and bitterness, but it also has the ideal notes of coffee, cocoa, and also dark chocolate that we need for this clone. That is not to say that a substitute dehusked version will not be good, it just may not be quite as suitable for this beer as the Wyoming version. After the mash it was time for the sparge, which I prefer to perform manually by hand using a jug. As long as you have your grain crush right, then this should be a fast enough process, but it is not something you want to rush. The important factor here is that you use this water to wash over the entire grain bed as evenly as possible to wash out those remaining converted sugars from your grain. After the sparge, it is then time to ramp up to the boil. Once you hit boiling point, it is important to stir in all of the foam on top. This is an important step as this helps prevent a boil over. The foam is simply protein, which is a very important ingredient in this recipe, so please do not remove it, as I know some brewers like to. This should be done before adding in your first hops. This is actually one of my favourite parts of this brew because at this point the smell is simply amazing, and it's also a very relaxing process too. We can now add in our hop addition and give it a good stir. Details of our boil schedule are now shown on screen. My recipe stays consistent with the modern boil time of 30 minutes. Just to be sure on this, I did brew some test batches using both 60-minute and 30-minute boils to see if this had any effect, and quite frankly it did not, so 30 minutes it is. The hops used here are Pilot, which are just used for bittering. It is very unlikely that you would detect much or any flavour from these hops, but they do provide a very clean and crisp level of bitterness, and are British. If you cannot obtain Pilot, then this is certainly not the end of the world. You just simply want to use another form of bittering hop that offers the same or similar qualities. Magnum or Warrior are ideal sub-choices. I have tried this recipe with using East Kent Goldings, as some other clone recipes suggest, and frankly the result was not as good this way. During the end of the boil I used boiling hot water to sanitize my counterflow chiller before then cooling and transfer. Another area of experimentation was around which yeast to use. My testing has mostly been around using WLP007, which is apparently the exact same yeast strain that Guinness use, and Fermentis SO4, which is a very successful British yeast strain. Personally, I found that 007 left less of a yeast impression compared to SO4, which offers some very slight fruity and floral notes which work better from a flavour perspective. 007 I found left the beer a little drier in taste, but once again I preferred the ever so slightly less dry version offered by SO4. So SO4 gets my vote for this one, but I would suggest doing a split batch to see what you think. The differences are slight though, or at least are to my taste palette. Yours may be different. In terms of temperature for either of these two choices, I suggest keeping it at a steady fermentation temperature of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. If you do decide to use pressure, then give the yeast a break from this for the first 3 to 4 days so that you do not miss the yeast flavours and aromas. After that point, then I suggest using no more than 1 bar or 14.5 psi of pressure, which is consistent with the yeast industry's recommendations. At this point I would suggest that you are done. However, some people believe that Guinness should have a slight twang of sourness. It is fair to say that many people do not actually detect this in Guinness, but even so, it has had much discussion on the internet. Solutions I have found include souring a small section of the wort either by exposing it to old yeast or by using Brett or lacto or both. Some also talk about adding small amounts of food-grade lactic acid, which is what I would recommend until the beer is tasting the way you prefer it. I believe that when Guinness is brewed commercially, that they simply use a suitable water profile, like the one I suggested earlier in this video, to handle such balances. This is quite similar to the argument that Guinness tastes better in Ireland. Whilst recipes do vary from market to market, the actual taste is often governed greatly by how you are served the beer. If you are served Guinness in Ireland, then it could be that the bars there have a greater knowledge of how to properly clean and calibrate a nitro tap setup, as they have direct training from Guinness themselves. These same things will also have an effect on your homebrewed version too. Naturally, a nitro tap setup is going to cost a fair amount of money, so I understand that most of you that will brew this recipe will not have one, and for that matter, neither do I. What I do have is Kegland's Stout spout connected to one of my Nuka taps, but this also works with the older enter taps too. The Stout spout has a removable creamer disc inside, and this actually works really well without nitro, but gets a nice boost if used as part of a nitro setup. So this is a good option whichever way you want to go, and it's very reasonably priced too. Here is a look at the pour using the Stout spout and at the same time the finished beer, and after this I will give you my tasting notes. You can see that the pour is a dark brown in colour, but once in the glass the end beer is totally black, just as you would expect for this beer. This beer has been under 12 psi of pressure in the keg, which is 0.83 bars, and I'm using this pressure for serving too. The example you see here is at around the 4-week point from kegging, and it's conditioned flavour wise very nicely in this time. However, I do often find that regular stouts seem to peak given further weeks of conditioning. With this beer I have stored it in a keg within my kegerator at 7 degrees Celsius or approximately 44 degrees Fahrenheit, but when I serve it I let it stand for at least a few minutes before diving in for tasting. This is because I find that with this style it is really best for my taste buds at a slightly higher temperature all of the flavours to be enjoyed. We all do taste a little differently though, so do your own testing here for sure. Let's now go through my tasting notes, starting with aroma. The slightly sweet aroma found here contains dark chocolate and coffee, as well as some dark fruit which includes plums and dates in the background. There is also slight alcohol and sour notes that only some will detect. Flavour. This beer is nice and light on entry with a little creamy factor that holds till the end, smooth bitterness. The experience in the middle starts a little sweet but is quickly becoming roasty with light chocolate and coffee that has a pleasant but astringent character. Here are my notes on this beer. I made some side-by-side tastings with actual Guinness drafts sold in cans with a small panel of friends with my recipe at various stages of development. At the last session everyone found that the two beers were very similar, and dare I say it, the majority preferred the subtle differences found in my homebrew version with blind tastings. My version was perceived by the majority as simply a little less astringent, which was preferable to most of their taste palates, it seems. It was at this point that I declared the recipe final. I cannot say that you will prefer my version, but frankly it does have an advantage in that it isn't mass-produced, and is also somewhat a fresher state, I would imagine, by the law of averages. Here is my final impression. This is a Guinness clone that I am very proud of, that ticks the right boxes and yet is very easy to brew and finish. So there you have it. Do let myself and the community know what you think of this video, and then later on, once you have brewed this recipe, your own tasting notes. It is actually not so often that I am producing clone recipes, as I prefer to design my own recipes from scratch. However, if you have any requests for future clones, then please do let me know in the comment section of this video. I do hope that you found this video useful, informative and interesting. If so, why not consider liking and subscribing? For further support you can join the channel's Facebook group, and if you would like to support the channel then check out the channel's merchandise store, as all profits go back into the channel. Until next time, happy brewing!